The wooden splinters exploded inward as the bullet tore through the rocking horse's front leg. Keiko Fujimoto didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still on the toy's leather saddle, hands gripping the horsehair mane while gunfire cracked through the Tokyo night, and Sergeant Marcus Coleman's body pressed against the doorframe, shielding her from three drunk American soldiers across the street who had decided that a black NCO protecting a Japanese woman was an insult worth killing over. The bullet that shattered that leg wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to send a message. But the message it actually sent would end 3 military careers, save dozens of lives, and prove that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy become the most powerful weapons of all. They called it the Rocking Horse Protocol, a simple instruction that would save her life. Just sit on it, don't move. Make them think twice about what it would cost to move you. It seemed absurd. A woman sitting calmly on a child's toy while armed men surrounded her flashlights, cutting through darkness, voices thick with alcohol and rage. But in the chaos of occupied Tokyo, March 1946, absurdity was often the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. How did a simple toy become the flashpoint for a confrontation that would expose the deepest contradictions in America's post-war occupation? The answer begins 6 days earlier with a wooden crate that wasn't supposed to be there. March 18, 1946, 6 months after Japan's surrender. Keiko returned to her makeshift shelter in the ruins of Sumida Ward to find something impossible sitting exactly where her carefully rationed rice should be. A wooden crate, military markings she couldn't read, no delivery note, no explanation, just sitting there like it had always belonged in this bombed-out schoolhouse she called home. The lid wasn't nailed shut. That detail struck her as odd immediately. Military supplies typically arrive sealed tight, secured against the chaos of supply lines stretching across the Pacific. This box opened with minimal effort, hinges creaking softly as she lifted the top, releasing the smell of fresh sawdust and machine oil. Inside, cushioned by straw and cloth, sat something that made absolutely no sense in a city where people burned furniture for warmth and traded family heirlooms for scraps of food. A rocking horse. Not just any toy, but an elaborate piece with genuine leather saddle-painted eyes that seemed almost alive and a mane made from actual horsehair. The craftsmanship spoke of American abundance, that casual excess she'd witnessed in occupation soldiers who seemed to have everything while her country starved. This is the story of how that toy became a symbol of resistance, how a black sergeant from Jim Crow, Alabama, and a widowed Japanese teacher formed an alliance that challenged the very nature of occupation, and how a simple instruction became a philosophy that would ripple through decades. Before we continue with Keiko's discovery, I want to ask you something. If you or your family members served during the occupation of Japan, or if you remember this period from the newsreels and radio broadcasts, share your memories in the comments below. These stories matter. Your perspective matters. Now let's go back to that moment when Keiko first opened the crate and found something that would change everything. Keiko Fujimoto wasn't supposed to be alive. On the night of March 9, 1945, 1 year before she found that mysterious crate, American B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The firestorm killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Her husband Hiroshi had been teaching late at their elementary school. She'd been at her sister's house in the suburbs, arguing over whether to evacuate or stay. By the time she returned the next morning, their school was gone. Their home was gone. Hiroshi was gone. All that remained was the smell of burning wood and flesh, a smell she could still taste when the wind blew wrong. For 10 months she survived alone in the ruins, learned to be invisible, learned which American patrols to avoid and which could be approached for ration cards. Learned that eye contact could mean either mercy or violation depending on who was looking. Survival became a mathematical equation she calculated daily. Wake before dawn, count remaining rice grains, 43 today, boil water over a fire made from book pages. Today, a damaged copy of The Tale of Genji. She whispered apology to the author before burning his words. Then the daily pilgrimage to the American Ration Center. The ration centers were theaters of controlled humiliation. Not by design, at least not official design, but by the simple mathematics of power. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, mostly women and elderly, lined up before tables staffed by young American soldiers. The soldiers weren't cruel exactly, just tired, overwhelmed. increasingly frustrated by language barriers that turned simple food distribution into hours-long ordeals. Keiko watched an elderly man, Mr. Tanaka, try to explain that his ration card had been stolen. The American private couldn't have been more than 19. He kept saying, "No card, no food," in increasingly loud English, as if volume could bridge comprehension. Mr. Tanaka bowed deeper with each repetition, his dignity measured in degrees of spine curvature. "Please, Sir," Keiko said in careful English, stepping forward. "He's saying card was stolen. He have family. Children very hungry." The private looked at her with surprise and something like relief. "You speak English?" Small, Keiko replied, using the phrase she'd learned worked best, not claiming too much competence, which could threaten but enough to be useful. The private issued an emergency ration card. Mr. Tanaka bowed to both of them, tears in his eyes, that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the thin line between eating and starving. That small act of translation caught someone's attention. Someone who'd been watching the ration lines for weeks, looking for Japanese civilians with English skills, and more importantly, with dignity intact, despite impossible circumstances. Which brings us back to that impossible crate in her shelter. Keiko knelt beside it, fingers trembling as they traced the rough wood. In these uncertain times, anything connected to occupation forces could mean trouble or opportunity, and distinguishing between the two often proved fatal. She lifted the lids slowly. The hinges creaked at sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the ruined building. The smell hit her first: fresh wood, machine oil, and something else. Leather, real leather. She hadn't smelled genuine leather in over a year. And there it sat, the rocking horse, glossy painted body, deep chestnut brown, saddle with tooled patterns and brass rivets, mane made from actual horsehair, not rope or paper substitutes. And those eyes, glass eyes that caught the evening light and seemed to watch her with patient curiosity. She ran her hand along the saddle. The leather was supple, well-conditioned. Someone had cared for this toy before sending it here. Beneath the straw packing, she found a folded piece of paper, typed in English, "For civilian welfare. Authorized distribution. Keep paperwork visible. Signed is Sergeant M. Coleman, Logistics Division." Below that, handwritten in precise block letters, "Ma'am, if you're reading this, someone saw you help Mr. Tanaka. What's in this horse might save your life. Don't open the compartment until I explain in person. I'll be by tomorrow evening. Trust me." Trust him. Trust an American soldier she'd never met. But that handwriting, something about those careful letters, suggested a man who chose his words with the same precision he'd used to pack this crate. What Keiko didn't know was that Sergeant Marcus Coleman had spent 3 days preparing that crate. 3 days gathering supplies through carefully manipulated requisition forms. 3 days calculating how to protect a woman he'd never spoken to, based purely on watching her show kindness to an old man at a ration line. And what she definitely didn't know was what else was hidden inside that horse. Something that would force her to make a decision she'd been avoiding since the night her husband died. Whether to remain a victim of circumstances or to become something else entirely. To understand why Marcus Coleman would risk his career for a Japanese civilian he'd never met, you need to understand what happened on a summer night in 1939 in rural Alabama when he was 17 years old. The Coleman family farm sat 3 miles outside Bessemer, Alabama. 40 acres of tired soil that barely grew enough cotton to keep them fed. Marcus was walking home from the general store when he saw the crowd gathered by the old oak tree. Later, he couldn't remember their faces, just the backs of their heads, white shirts glowing in twilight, the smell of kerosene and crushed grass, and the terrible creaking sound of rope against wood. The man's name was Samuel Washington. His crime allegedly speaking disrespectfully to a white store clerk. That was the official version. The real version, he'd refused to accept short payment for a week's farm work. Marcus saw Sheriff Hutchins standing 20 feet back, arms crossed, watching. Not participating, but definitely not stopping. When Samuel's wife, Clara, tried to push through the crowd, the sheriff stopped her. "Nothing to see here, Clara. Best you get on home." Marcus never forgot the sheriff's tone. Not angry, not cruel, just administrative, as if a man dying by rope was a matter of paperwork and jurisdiction. That night, 17-year-old Marcus Coleman learned something that would shape the rest of his life. Systems don't protect people. People protect people. And when good people decide someone else's problems aren't their concern, systems become weapons. 8 years later, Sergeant Marcus Coleman stood in occupied Tokyo watching Japanese civilians bow to American soldiers at ration lines. And he saw Clara Washington's face in every Japanese woman who had to beg for food. Saw Samuel Washington in every civilian treated as less than human by people who claimed to represent freedom. The knock came exactly at sunset, 3 firm raps. Professional? Not threatening, but not tentative either. Miss Fujimoto, Sergeant Coleman, we need to talk about that horse. Keiko opened the door to find a tall black man in olive uniform, maybe 32, with careful eyes that assessed everything without seeming to judge. He moved deliberately, hands visible. Voice calm. Ma'am, I'm coming in, but slowly. Gonna keep my hands where you can see them. I know you got no reason to trust me. I'm asking you to anyway, just for 10 minutes. Then you can decide. He settled onto a broken chair, testing at first, respecting her space. Up close, Keiko noticed details. His uniform was regulation perfect boots, polished, but his hands showed calluses that spoke of actual work, not just desk duty. That horse ain't just a toy, ma'am. It's insurance, protection, and something you might need if the wrong kind of soldiers come around. He gestured toward the rocking horse. You checked the compartment yet? Keiko shook her head. Your notes say wait. Smart. Let me show you how it works. Then we'll talk about why. Coleman moved to the horse, ran his hand along its neck until his fingers found the right ear. He pressed. A soft click, like a latch releasing. Push here, then lift the saddle. Like this. The saddle rose smoothly, revealing a hollow compartment beneath. Keiko gasped. Inside, packed with military precision. 12 cans of food labels facing up. Pork and beans, canned peaches, saltine crackers, corned beef, each one a fortune on Tokyo's black market. Medical supplies in a canvas pouch. Bandages still in sterile paper. Iodine in a brown glass bottle. White pills in a tin labeled aspirin. Another tin sulfa powder for infections. And they're wrapped in oiled cloth that smelled of gunmetal and careful preservation. A knife, 6 inches of forged steel edge, so sharp it caught the candlelight like a razor. Leather-wrapped handle, brass pommel, a fighting knife, a killing knife, a survival knife. Coleman lifted it carefully, held it flat on his palms. An offering, not a threat. I ain't suggesting you go looking for trouble, ma'am, and I surely hope you never need to use this. But if those soldiers I warned about decide to come around when I ain't nearby. He paused, made sure she understood. You got options. You understand what I'm saying? Keiko stared at the blade. She'd never held a weapon. Her father had been a teacher. Her husband had been a teacher. Their lives had been books and chalk dust, not steel and blood. But she'd also watched her world burn. Watched her husband disappear into smoke and ash. Spent 10 months learning that survival required becoming someone she'd never imagined being. Slowly she reached out, took the knife, felt its weight. I understand, she said quietly. Now here's what you need to know about staying alive under occupation. Coleman's tone shifted to something almost instructional. Most soldiers, they'll respect official documentation. They got to. Military runs on paperwork. That requisition form I left you, keep it visible. Somewhere anyone entering would see it immediately. He pointed to the shelf. Right there's perfect. Anyone questions why you got an expensive toy, you show them that paper. Says you're part of the Civilian Welfare Distribution Program, which as of yesterday, you officially are. But there's a specific group you need to worry about. 3 soldiers, Corporal Frank Delaney and his boys, Stevens and Walsh. They've been, Coleman chose his words carefully, problematic. They've been targeting isolated civilians, especially women living alone. Reports have been filed, but investigations take time, and enforcement ain't always what it should be. Keiko's stomach tightened. She'd heard whispers at the ration lines. Women speaking in lowered voices about soldiers who came after dark. Some stories ended with theft. Some ended worse. Coleman stood, walked to the rocking horse. This weighs about 40 pounds with everything packed inside. Too heavy for you to move easily. So here's what you do if trouble comes. He sat on it. Full weight, the horse settled firmly against the floor. You sit on it, right here, just like I'm doing now. Seems silly, I know, but hear me out. You sit on it with your full weight, and suddenly it ain't something that can be easily grabbed and carried off. It becomes furniture, something they'd have to physically remove you from before taking. You following Keiko nodded slowly. The absurdity made perfect sense. Just sit on it, Coleman repeated, as if the words were a mantra. Don't argue, don't buy, don't negotiate, don't explain. Just sit down, calm and quiet, like it's the most natural thing in the world. Make them think twice about the effort required, about the scene it would cause, about the paperwork and questions that might follow if they force the issue. And if they don't stop, Keiko asked quietly. Coleman's face hardened. Then you remember what's hidden inside and you do what you need to do to survive. But it shouldn't come to that. I'm arranging for more patrols in this sector, more oversight. Captain's already approved it, though he don't know exactly why I requested it. Why the word came out before she could stop it. Why you help me, you have nothing gain, only danger, because I know what it's like to be in a place where the people in charge don't see you as fully human, Coleman said quietly. Where the rules that are supposed to protect everybody somehow don't apply to you the same way. He met her eyes. I grew up in Alabama, ma'am. Jim Crow South, colored water fountains, back of the bus, whites-only signs everywhere. I know what occupation feels like from the other side, even if the circumstances are different. A pause, then, and I know what happens when good people decide that somebody else's problems ain't worth the trouble of getting involved. Something passed between them then. Not romance, nothing so simple, but recognition. The kind that happens when two people who've both learned to survive in systems designed to diminish them see each other clearly. I need to go before someone notices I've been here too long. But Miss Fujimoto Keiko, you see me around, don't acknowledge it unless I speak first. Safer that way. At the door he paused. One more thing. Those 3 soldiers I mentioned, Delaney and his boys, if they come around, remember, just sit on it. Don't let anyone move you from what's rightfully yours. After Coleman left, Keiko spent an hour examining the rocking horse with new eyes. The craftsmanship remained impressive, but now she understood it served purposes beyond decoration. She pressed the right ear as instructed, feeling the subtle click of the hidden mechanism. The saddle lifted smoothly, revealing the compartment beneath. The supplies were packed with military precision. Cans labeled in English, their contents mysterious but promising. Bandages, antiseptic, pills whose purpose she could only guess. And they're wrapped in oilcloth, the knife Coleman had mentioned. She lifted it carefully, feeling the balanced weight testing the edge against her thumb with cautious respect. The blade caught the afternoon light, filtering through broken windows, sending a brief flash across damaged walls. She'd never held a weapon before the war. Her father had been a teacher, her mother a seamstress. Their lives defined by books and fabric rather than violence. The war had changed many things, but some innocences remained stubbornly intact despite the surrounding destruction. Holding this knife felt like crossing a threshold she had managed to avoid even during the worst of the bombing raids and their aftermath. The sound of voices outside made her replace everything, quickly lowering the saddle and ensuring it locked properly. She moved to the window, staying back from the opening, watching as a group of civilians passed by carrying their daily rations, faces tired and defeated. Nobody looked up at her building. Nobody noticed her watching. The anonymity that had protected her continued holding for now. Night fell with the abrupt darkness of late March. Keiko rationed her candle carefully, allowing herself only enough light to prepare a small meal from the canned goods Coleman had provided. The food tasted foreign, overly sweet in unexpected ways, but the nutrition it offered exceeded anything available through official ration channels. She ate slowly, making the meal last, trying to remember when she'd last felt genuinely full, rather than simply less hungry. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by the usual sounds of occupation. Distant engines, occasional shouts, the general restlessness of a city learning to exist under foreign control. She'd grown somewhat accustomed to these sounds over the past months, developing a calibrated sense of which noises required attention and which could be safely ignored. The footsteps that woke her near midnight fell decidedly into the former category. Multiple people moving without attempting stealth, but not advertising their presence either. They stopped outside her building, voices carrying through damaged walls with unclear intent. Somebody's been using this place. The English words were slurred slightly, suggesting alcohol, but not complete intoxication. Saw smoke from the chimney 2 days running. Means supplies, maybe food, maybe other things worth finding. Could just be squatters, a second voice responded, less certain. Place is pretty wrecked. Might not be worth the trouble. Only one way to find out. The first speaker sounded closer now, right outside the front entrance. Besides, if it's a woman alone like Jenkins thinks, might be entertaining either way. The casual cruelty in that statement sent ice through Keiko's veins. She moved quietly to the rocking horse. Coleman's instructions echoed in her mind with new urgency. Just sit on it. She positioned herself on the saddle, feeling the solid weight of the hidden supplies beneath her, the concealed knife pressing through fabric against her leg. The door opened with a crash, either kicked or shouldered. 3 American soldiers entered, flashlights cutting through darkness with aggressive sweeps. They weren't Coleman's unit. She could tell that immediately from their demeanor and the casual way they invaded her space. These men carried themselves with the entitled confidence of people accustomed to operating without meaningful consequences. Well, the lead soldier, a corporal based on his stripes, fixed his flashlight on her. Looks like Jenkins was right. You speak English, sweetheart. Understand what's happening here. Keiko remained silent, gripping the rocking horse beneath her, feeling the wood solid and steady. Her heart hammered, but she kept her face carefully neutral, remembering the survival lessons learned during air raids. Showing fear invited escalation. Maintaining composure sometimes created pause. I asked you a question. The corporal moved closer, his companions spreading out to flank him. They were performing a routine, she realized, a practiced intimidation that had probably worked many times before. You got any supplies in here? Food, valuables, anything that might belong to the occupation authority, Toy Keiko said, carefully gesturing to the horse beneath her. From American program. Official. The corporal's laugh held no warmth. Official program. That's funny. Ain't heard of no program giving out toys to civilians. You trying to tell me stories? He directed his flashlight at the rocking horse, examining it with narrowed eyes. The beam caught the worn leather of the saddle, the carefully painted details, the overall quality that seemed incongruous with its surroundings. That's actually a pretty nice piece, one of the other soldiers observed, moving closer for a better look. Probably worth something back home. Real horsehair mane, leather saddle. My kid would love this. There you go, the corporal said, turning back to Keiko. My friend here likes your toy. Why don't you get up and let us take a closer look? We'll make sure it gets to a good home where it'll be appreciated. Keiko tightened her grip on the horse's mane, keeping her voice steady. No, is mine. Have paper. Official paper. Say this for me. Paper. The corporal's tone sharpened. Show me this paper. She pointed carefully toward the shelf where she'd placed Coleman's documents, not moving from her position. There. You look. You see? Is official. The third soldier, who had remained quieter than his companions, crossed to the shelf and retrieved the folded form. He examined it by flashlight, his expression shifting as he read. Actually, Corp, she ain't lying. This is signed by Captain Hendricks, dated 3 days ago. Says right here, civilian welfare distribution, one children's toy, authorized recipient. He squinted at the paper. Can't make out the name, but the stamp looks legit. The corporal's confidence wavered slightly. Let me see that. He snatched the paper, studying it with growing frustration. Official documentation complicated things, created potential complications if questions got asked later. Still, he wasn't quite ready to abandon the situation. Okay, so maybe it was issued officially, but how do we know you're the authorized recipient? Could be you stole this from somewhere else, not stolen. Keiko insisted, her limited English forcing simple declarations. Mine. Given to me. You should go now. Should we? The corporal stepped closer, his posture aggressive. Thing is, we're the occupation authority here. We decide what's official and what ain't, and right now I'm deciding I need to verify this situation more thoroughly. He reached toward her hand, extended to pull her from the horse. Keiko didn't move. Coleman's words echoed in her mind. Just sit on it, calm and quiet. Make them think twice. She met the corporal's eyes without flinching, her hands tight on the horse, her entire body language communicating stubborn, absolute resistance. Come on, get up, the corporal demanded, his voice rising. I ain't got all night for this nonsense. No? Keiko said simply. The soldier who had read the paperwork shifted uncomfortably. Corp, maybe we should just leave this alone. The document looks legitimate, and if Captain Hendricks really authorized this, we could get jammed up for interfering with welfare distribution. Remember what happened to Peterson when he got caught taking civilian supplies? The corporal hesitated, clearly torn between his initial intentions and the growing complications. The silence stretched tension building in the close space. Then footsteps sounded outside, distinct and purposeful. Well, this is interesting. Coleman's voice cut through the standoff with controlled authority. He appeared in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his eyes absolutely hard. Gentlemen didn't expect to find anyone from outside our patrol sector here this time of night. Care to explain what's going on? The corporal straightened reflexively, responding to Coleman's sergeant stripes, despite the racial dynamics that normally would have inverted that deference. Just checking on reports of unauthorized occupation, Sergeant. Making sure everything's in order. Is that right? Coleman entered the room fully, his gaze moving deliberately from the soldiers to Keiko, still seated on the rocking horse, then back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like you're hassling a civilian who's got proper documentation for that toy there. Documentation I happen to know about because I processed it through welfare distribution 3 days ago. The quiet soldier held up the paperwork. He's right, Corp. It's all legitimate. Coleman took the paper, examining it briefly before handing it back to Keiko with deliberate courtesy. Ma'am, I apologize for this disturbance. These soldiers are out of their assigned area and apparently not familiar with the welfare programs we've established in this sector. He turned to the corporal, his voice hardening. I suggest you and your men return to your proper patrol zone now, unless you'd prefer I file a report about this incident with Captain Hendricks, who takes civilian harassment pretty seriously. The corporal's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he recognized the trap. Coleman had established civilian protection protocols that made interference legally problematic, while his relationship with the captain gave him leverage that transcended the usual racial hierarchy. Pushing further would create problems that weren't worth whatever they'd hoped to accomplish here. We're done here, the corporal muttered, gesturing to his companions. Come on. As they filed out, the corporal paused at the doorframe, looking back at Coleman with pure hatred. This ain't over, Coleman. You and your Jap friends ain't fooling anybody about what this really is. Coleman waited until their footsteps faded completely before speaking. You okay? Keiko finally allowed herself to dismount from the rocking horse. Her legs trembled, slightly, adrenaline aftermath making movement uncertain. I do what you say. I sit. I not move. You did perfect, Coleman said. Sitting still took more courage than fighting would have. You understand that? She nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. Understanding that she'd just crossed some invisible line, become something more than victim or survivor, become someone who could resist simply by refusing to be moved. Miss Fujimoto Keiko, I need you to understand something. What just happened? That was Delaney testing boundaries, seeing what he could get away with. Now that he knows I'm watching, knows you're protected. Coleman's expression darkened. Men like him don't back down. They escalate. He's going to look for leverage against me, probably already building some kind of case. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's something else you need to know. Tomorrow there's going to be a protest at the Eastern Checkpoint. The elder Tatsuo Yamamoto. You know him? Keiko nodded. Everyone in Sumida Ward knew Yamamoto-sensei. He's organizing resistance to the new ration restrictions, planning to block the checkpoint until someone agrees to review the policy. It's going to get ugly, Keiko, and when it does, Delaney's going to use the chaos as cover for something worse. Over the next 3 days, Keiko's life changed in ways both subtle and profound. Coleman appeared at midday on March 20th with paperwork. Real paperwork. Multiple carbon copies, official stamps, captain's signature. You're now listed as Civilian Auxiliary Translator Division. Means you got legitimate status. Anyone questions you, this gives you standing. The document was dense with military language, but Keiko understood the crucial parts. Official employee, protected classification, reporting directly to Captain Hendricks, Civilian Affairs. That afternoon, her ration card was upgraded. Instead of the usual watery rice gruel and occasional vegetables, she received real butter, a full pound wrapped in wax paper. Canned milk, sweet, thick American condensed milk. White bread, soft, pillowy white bread that squeaked when she pressed it. She ate slowly that night, trying to make each bite last. The butter had a richness that made her dizzy after months of near starvation. The bread stuck to the roof of her mouth in the most glorious way. The next day, Coleman brought her to the ration distribution center, not as a recipient this time, but as staff. "We need someone who can actually communicate with these folks," he explained. "Someone who understands both sides." She spent 6 hours translating, mediating, explaining to frustrated American soldiers why elderly Japanese civilians kept bowing instead of just taking their food. "It's respect, sir. They're showing gratitude." Explaining to Japanese civilians why the Americans seem so impatient. "They're not being rude, Oji-san. They're just overwhelmed by the numbers." That's when she met Private Eugene Davis. 21, freckled from somewhere called Ohio that he described as lots of corn and not much else. Davis watched her work with obvious admiration. "Ma'am, you just prevented about 5 arguments in the last hour. Usually takes us twice as long to distribute rations and everybody leaves angry." He glanced at Coleman. "Sergeant Coleman said you might be able to teach me some Japanese basic phrases." Coleman nodded approval. "Building bridges, Davis. That's how we turn occupation into cooperation." After her shift, Davis approached Keiko again, his voice lowered. "Ma'am, you should know. Corporal Delaney's been talking. Says Coleman's overstepping, says he's protecting Japanese civilians at expense of American security. He's gathering support to file formal complaint." Keiko realized then that Coleman's help had painted a target on his back. That evening, Coleman invited Keiko for official debrief, their code for the conversations that had become routine. He would stop by ostensibly to check on the welfare distribution item, but really to talk, to share the burden of trying to be decent people in indecent circumstances. This evening he opened a letter that had arrived from Italy and after a moment's hesitation read portions aloud. His brother David, 1st Lieutenant, 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. "Dear Marcus, we flew bomber escort to Berlin yesterday. Lost Jackson, good pilot, better man. Makes 14 from our squadron since we deployed. The white bomber crews thank us now. Call us their guardian angels. Same crews whose officers wouldn't eat with us stateside, wouldn't even acknowledge us in the briefing rooms. Funny how perspective changes when your life depends on somebody you used to call not good enough." Coleman's voice remained steady, but Keiko heard the emotion beneath. "You asked if this is worth it, fighting for a country that won't fight for us at home. I think about that every mission. Every time I climb into that cockpit, I'm fighting 2 wars, one against the enemy abroad, one against the assumptions at home. But here's what I believe. We're not fighting for the America that is. We're fighting for the America that could be. Every mission we fly, every enemy plane we shoot down, we're proving that competence ain't got nothing to do with skin color." He paused, looking at Keiko. "You're doing the same work where you are, little brother, protecting those Japanese civilians, standing up to injustice, even when it's easier to look away. That's how systems change, not through grand gestures, through 1,000 small acts of choosing what's right over what's convenient. Keep fighting the good fight. I'll keep fighting mine. Maybe someday we'll both come home to a country worthy of the fight." Coleman folded the letter carefully. Keiko saw his hands trembling slightly. "He wrote this 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. He could be dead now, and I wouldn't know yet. Mail takes that long." "He is still alive," Keiko said with certainty she didn't quite feel. "Good pilots survive, and good men, they have reasons to come home. That's why I do this," Coleman said, gesturing vaguely at everything. "The rocking horse, the paperwork, the whole impossible situation. My brother's fighting Nazis while being treated as second class at home. If I can't stand up for what's right here, what's the point of any of it?" Keiko shared her own story then. Husband Hiroshi, elementary school teacher, like her. Died in the March 1945 firebombing. She was at her sister's house in the suburbs that night, survived by chance. Returned to find their home gone, school destroyed, Hiroshi's body never found. Spent a year surviving alone, learning to be invisible. "At first, I hate all Americans," she confessed. "Every soldier I see, I think of bombs falling. But then you leave me horse risk yourself to help me. You make me remember. People are not their governments. Kindness exists even in occupation." Coleman leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "I need to tell you something. Captain Hendricks is under pressure to rein in the civilian welfare program. Higher command thinks we're being too lenient with former enemy population. They want to see more control, less cooperation." The danger became clear. If Delaney's complaint gains traction, Hendricks might be forced to shut down auxiliary program entirely to prove he's not soft. What this means for Keiko: loss of protection status, ration access, housing security. I'm not going to let that happen, Coleman said. But it means we need to show them this program works. That cooperation is better than coercion. He paused. There's a community leader, Tatsuo Yamamoto. You know him? Keiko nodded. He was senior teacher at neighboring school before war, respected elder. He's been organizing quiet resistance to new ration restrictions. Not violent, just refusal to cooperate until policies change. It's building toward confrontation. Captain Hendricks asked me to reach out, see if we can mediate before it explodes. Coleman's request hung in the air. I need your help. You know Yamamoto, you understand both sides. Will you help me prevent this from turning ugly? I helped, Keiko decided, but not just for program, for my people. They deserve dignity too. To understand why Yamamoto was organizing protests, you need to understand the mathematics of starvation. March 1946, 6 months into occupation. Initial relief efforts had stabilized Tokyo, prevented mass death from exposure and disease. But then the bureaucrats got involved. New policy from MacArthur's headquarters: reduce ration allocations by 30%. The reasoning encouraged Japanese self-sufficiency, prevent dependency on American aid, make the occupation fiscally sustainable. On paper, it made sense. In reality, the reduced rations provided 1,000 calories per day. Subsistence level is 1,600. Manual labor requires 2,000 plus. Most families had no alternative food sources. Black market prices had tripled. Gardens couldn't grow in rubble. Fishing boats had been destroyed or confiscated. At the medical clinics, doctors documented the consequences. Elderly dying of natural causes, actually starvation. Children showing developmental delays, malnutrition. Adults too weak to work, perpetuating the cycle. Keiko saw it daily at the distribution center. Mothers pinching off portions of their own rations to feed children. Elderly refusing food entirely, insisting their grandchildren needed it more. The quiet mathematics of who deserved to eat and who could be sacrificed. She reported to Captain Hendricks. Sir, these restrictions, people will die. Hendricks, clearly frustrated. Miss Fujimoto, you think I don't see it? These orders came from the top. I'm a captain. I don't have authority to countermand SCAP directives. But Tatsuo Yamamoto had decided that following proper channels had failed. Time for improper ones. Before we continue with what happened at that checkpoint, I want to ask you something. Many of you watching served in the military during this era. Some of you might have been part of the occupation forces. Others might have family members who served. What was your experience with military policy versus on-the-ground reality? Did you ever face situations where official orders contradicted what you knew was right? Share your stories in the comments. These perspectives help us understand history beyond the official records. Now let's talk about what Tatsuo Yamamoto did next. Coleman arranged a secret meeting. Location: corner of a destroyed temple in Sumida Ward. Night of March 23rd. Participants: Coleman, Keiko, and Tatsuo Yamamoto, plus 2 other community leaders. Yamamoto was 67, gaunt from hunger, but carrying himself with dignity that starvation couldn't touch. Former school principal. Lost his wife and grandson to the firebombing. Now de facto leader of civilian resistance. Quiet, organized, nonviolent. Through Keiko's translation, Yamamoto presented his position. Sergeant Coleman, I respect that you are trying to help from inside the system. But the system is designed to ignore people like us. We have submitted 7 written petitions since February. All acknowledged, none answered. Tomorrow, March 24th, we will gather at the Eastern Checkpoint. Approximately 50 civilians, mostly elderly and mothers with children. We will sit peacefully and block access until someone with authority agrees to meet with us. To actually listen. We are not violent people. We are not rebels. We are starving, and we will not cooperate with our own starvation. Coleman attempted to dissuade him. Mr. Yamamoto, I understand your frustration. God knows I do, but blocking military checkpoints will be seen as security threat. They'll use force to remove you. People could get hurt. Elderly children. That's exactly the outcome you're trying to prevent. Yamamoto's response was measured. Then let them use force against peaceful, starving people. Let them show the world what American occupation truly means when the cameras aren't running. He leaned forward. Sergeant, you are a good man. You try to work within the system, but systems protect themselves. They do not change from gentle pressure. They change when the cost of not changing becomes higher than the cost of changing. Keiko intervened. Yamamoto-sensei, please. Coleman-san has real influence with Captain Hendricks. Give him more time. If violence happens, it helps no one. Yamamoto looked at her with something like pity. Keiko-chan, I taught you when you were 10 years old. Do you remember you wrote beautiful essays about peace and understanding? I still believe in those values, but peace cannot mean accepting injustice quietly. Understanding cannot mean watching children starve while we wait for the powerful to develop empathy. Coleman sat silent for a long moment. Outside Tokyo's ruins stretched in every direction, visible evidence of what happens when systems fail, when leaders choose power over people. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Yamamoto, I can't stop you. And honestly, part of me doesn't want to. You're right that the system ain't working, but I'm asking you, give me 24 hours. Let me try something before you go public with this protest. He paused, weighing the words. If I can't get Captain Hendricks to agree to an emergency review of the ration policy by noon tomorrow, I'll stand with you at that checkpoint, in uniform. The room went silent. Even Yamamoto looked stunned. Keiko found her voice first. Coleman-san, that's insubordination. You could be court-martialed, discharged, lose everything. Maybe Coleman said quietly. But my brother's flying combat missions over Europe fighting Nazis while being treated as second-class citizen at home. If I can't stand up for what's right here, what's the point of wearing this uniform? Yamamoto studied him for a long time. You would risk your career for us, for strangers, for former enemies. I'd risk it for what's right, Coleman corrected. That's not the same thing as charity or pity. It's about the kind of world I want to live in, the kind my brother's fighting to create. Yamamoto nodded slowly. Very well, Sergeant Coleman. You have until noon tomorrow. If Captain Hendricks agrees to emergency review and temporary suspension of the new restrictions, we will postpone the protest. Give the system its chance. He extended his hand. But if not, we stand together. They shook. A Black American sergeant and an elderly Japanese teacher making a pact that could end both their lives as they knew them. After Yamamoto left, Keiko turned to Coleman. Why you do this? Why you risk so much? Because systems don't change themselves, Coleman said. They change when people inside them decide that fairness matters more than safety. My brother taught me that. And if I ain't willing to live by it, I got no business preaching it. What Coleman didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Corporal Frank Delaney had been following him for 3 days. Not personally, that would be too obvious. But Delaney had connections. Friends in the motor pool who could track vehicle movements. Friends in logistics who noted supply requisitions. And a private with a camera who owed him favors. By March 23rd, Delaney had photographs of Coleman entering Keiko's building multiple dates, multiple times. Records of supply requisitions showing Coleman requesting welfare items that matched what Keiko had received. Witness statements from other soldiers about Coleman's unusual interest in Japanese civilians. And now this. A photograph taken from distance showing Coleman, Keiko, and Yamamoto meeting in a destroyed temple. 3 people who should have no reason to meet secretly. Delaney showed the photos to Stevens and Walsh in their barracks. This is it. This is what we need. Negro sergeant conspiring with Japanese resistance leaders. Probably passing information, maybe supplies. At minimum, unauthorized fraternization. At worst, treason. Stevens looked uncomfortable. Frank, I don't know. That's a hell of an accusation. Are you seeing these pictures? He's got a Jap woman stashed in a building getting her special supplies meeting with their community organizers. What else would you call it? Tomorrow there's supposed to be some kind of protest at the eastern checkpoint, Delaney continued. Yamamoto's organizing it. Same man Coleman was just meeting with. When that protest happens, things are going to get chaotic. A lot of confusion, a lot of noise. And in that chaos, nobody's going to notice if Coleman's little Jap girlfriend has some kind of accident. Break-in, maybe. Valuables stolen. Tragic, but these things happen in occupied territory. Walsh shifted uncomfortably. Jesus, Frank, you're talking about. I'm talking about sending a message, Delaney cut him off. About what happens when soldiers forget which side they're on. Coleman didn't sleep. By dawn, he prepared his case, gathered statistics, drafted proposals. At 6 a.m., he knocked on Captain Hendricks' office door. "Sir, I need emergency meeting. It's critical." Hendricks, already at his desk, also hadn't slept. He looked up with exhausted eyes. "Coleman, it's barely sunrise. This better be end of world urgent." "It might be, sir. There's going to be a protest at Eastern Checkpoint at noon. Could turn violent. I can prevent it, but I need your authority." Coleman laid out the situation. Yamamoto organizing resistance. Approximately 50 civilians. Peaceful sit-in blocking checkpoint. If handled wrong, mass casualties. PR disaster. International incident. But I can mediate. I've got relationship with the community leader. He's willing to call it off if we show good faith. Specifically, emergency suspension of the new ration restrictions for 72 hours while you file formal review request with SCAP headquarters. Hendricks stared at him. "You're asking me to countermand orders from MacArthur's command, based on a meeting with Japanese resistance organizers that you shouldn't have been at in the first place. Sir, with respect, those orders are killing people. I can show you the medical reports if you want numbers. And those resistance organizers are school teachers and grandmothers trying to keep children from starving. That's not resistance. That's survival." "There's another problem," Hendricks said quietly. He pulled out a folder. "I received this yesterday. Formal complaint against you. From Corporal Delaney." He showed Coleman photographs. Coleman entering Keiko's building. Coleman meeting with Yamamoto. Supply requisitions. Delaney's alleging unauthorized fraternization with Japanese civilians, misappropriation of military supplies, conspiracy with enemy nationals. And he's got documentation. "Sir, I see every supply item I distributed went through proper channels. You signed half those requisition forms yourself. Miss Fujimoto is an authorized civilian auxiliary part of your program, and meeting with community leaders is literally my job description." Coleman met Hendricks' eyes directly. "But here's what this is really about. Delaney's a bigot who can't stand seeing a black NCO succeed at his job. He's using policy and protocol to disguise prejudice." He paused. "Now you can throw me under the bus to protect yourself politically. That's your right, but those civilians at that checkpoint, they didn't choose this. They're just trying to live. So I'm asking you, sir, what kind of officer do you want to be?" The silence stretched. Outside, Tokyo was waking up. Thousands of people preparing for another day of occupation rationing survival. Finally, Hendricks picked up his phone. "Get me Lieutenant Morrison in logistics, and tell Miss Fujimoto to report to my office immediately. We're going to need her translation skills." He looked at Coleman. "You got balls, Sergeant. Stupid career-ending balls. But let's see if we can make this work." The meeting took place in a partially rebuilt community center at 9 a.m. March 24th. Neutral ground carefully chosen. Present Captain Hendricks, Sergeant Coleman, Lieutenant Morrison from Logistics, Tatsuo Yamamoto, plus 2 community leaders whose weathered faces spoke of decades teaching Tokyo's children. Keiko Fujimoto, translating her careful English, bridging not just languages but entire worldviews. Private Davis taking notes, his young face serious with the weight of documenting history. The room smelled of fresh lumber and old ash rebuilt walls rising from foundations that still held the char marks of incendiary bombs. Through broken windows, the morning light illuminated dust motes floating like tiny ghosts of all the conversations this building had once held. Yamamoto presented his argument not with emotion, but with numbers. Mathematics of death delivered in the measured tones of a man who had spent 40 years teaching children that facts mattered more than feelings. Through Keiko's translation, current rations provide 1,000 calories per day per person. Medical minimum for survival, 1,600 calories. For manual labor, 2,000 plus calories required. Since new restrictions began 3 weeks ago, malnutrition cases up 47%, elderly mortality up 23%, children showing developmental delays consistent with starvation. He placed medical documentation on the table. Reports from civilian doctors signed and dated each page a testimony written in the clinical language of professional observation that couldn't quite hide the human tragedy beneath. "We have no alternative food sources. Black market prices are 3 times higher than before restrictions. Gardens cannot grow in rubble. Fishing boats were destroyed. We are not asking for luxury, Captain Hendricks. We are asking to not die." Hendricks leaned forward, studying the documents. His uniform was pressed crisp as always, but Keiko noticed details that suggested a man who hadn't slept. coffee stains on his cuff, shadow of stubble he'd missed while shaving in the pre-dawn darkness, the slight tremor in his hand as he turned pages that documented his policy's human cost. Why weren't these concerns raised through official channels? Yamamoto's response came swift. They were. 7 written petitions since February, all acknowledged, none answered. How many more should we write while children die? What's your proposed solution? Return to previous ration levels. Minimum, ideally increase based on actual caloric needs. Allow supervised local food production. Gardens in cleared areas. Controlled markets. Give us tools to feed ourselves instead of making us dependent on distributions that keep shrinking. Hendricks turned to Lieutenant Morrison. From supply standpoint, is this feasible? Morrison reviewed his notes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned that sometimes telling the truth to superior officers required diplomatic courage. Sir, I need to be honest. Current restrictions weren't based on supply limitations. We have surplus in warehouses. Could maintain current distribution levels for 18 months without resupply. The 30% reduction was policy decision too, and here he quoted from memory: discourage dependency and encourage self-sufficiency. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. But you can't be self-sufficient when your infrastructure's been destroyed. The policy assumed conditions that don't exist on the ground. From pure logistics perspective, we could restore previous allocation levels today and still maintain 6-month reserves. The silence that followed held weight. Hendricks sat back, clearly wrestling with implications that went beyond this room, beyond Tokyo, beyond even the occupation itself. This was about what kind of peace America intended to build from war's ashes. Whether occupation meant partnership or domination. Whether yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's allies or would remain forever subjugated. Here's what I can do, he said finally. I don't have authority to permanently change ration policy. That's above my jurisdiction. But I can authorize emergency suspension of restrictions for 72 hours while I file formal review request with SCAP headquarters. During that suspension, we return to previous allocation levels. I'll also recommend pilot program for controlled local food production. Garden supervised markets, everything you suggested. He met Yamamoto's eyes. In return, Mr. Yamamoto, you call off today's protest. Work with Sergeant Coleman to establish proper civilian feedback channels. Give the system a chance to work properly. Yamamoto conferred with his colleagues in quiet Japanese. Keiko deliberately didn't translate, giving them privacy for a decision that would affect thousands. She watched their faces, saw calculation mixed with hope, mixed with the bone-deep wariness of people who'd learned that promises from powerful men often evaporated like morning mist. Finally, Yamamoto turned back. We agree to 72-hour pause, Captain. But if your review is denied or delayed indefinitely, we will proceed with visible resistance. We will not cooperate with policies designed to kill us slowly. Hendricks extended his hand. That's your right as human beings. I wouldn't expect anything less. They shook. A significant moment. Power acknowledging humanity. The gesture carried symbolism that transcended the practical agreement, suggesting that perhaps occupation didn't have to mean the erasure of dignity. As the groups dispersed into Tokyo's morning light, Corporal Frank Delaney appeared with Stevens and Walsh. They'd been waiting, watching, building their case with the patience of men who believed righteousness justified any method. Well, Delaney's voice dripped contempt, thick as oil. Looks like Tokyo's Negro-Jap alliance just made military policy. Touching scene. Hendricks stepped forward, voice cold as January steel. Corporal Delaney, you're out of your assigned sector, again. And that tone insubordinate. Sir, with respect, I'm observing potential security breaches. That meeting you just had with Japanese resistance organizers, that meeting was authorized by me. Participants were invited. There's no breach except the one you're trying to fabricate. Delaney switched tactics, pulling out his folder like a prosecutor presenting evidence. What about Sergeant Coleman's activities, unauthorized supply distribution, fraternization with enemy nationals? I've got documentation, sir. Photographs, witnesses. Hendricks moved closer to Delaney, a power move that established dominance through proximity and the weight of rank earned through 2 decades of service. Let me explain something, Corporal. Every supply distribution Sergeant Coleman executed went through proper channels. Every civilian contact was part of his duties that I personally authorized. Your documentation shows a soldier doing his job exceptionally well. He leaned in, voice dropping to a register that promised consequences. What it also shows is you spending considerable time surveilling a superior NCO instead of performing your own duties, which raises questions about your conduct. The morning air seemed to thicken. Other soldiers had gathered, drawn by the confrontation's magnetic pull. This wasn't just about Coleman or Keiko or even the ration policy anymore. This was about whether racial prejudice could hide behind protocol, whether bigotry could weaponize bureaucracy. Your complaint will be investigated through proper channels, Hendricks continued. But until that investigation concludes, Sergeant Coleman remains on active duty with full authority. And Corporal, if I find you've been harassing authorized personnel or civilians, I will personally ensure your next assignment involves counting inventory in the Aleutian Islands. Are we crystal clear, Crystal, sir? Delaney managed, face flushed with rage and humiliation mixing into something toxic. As he walked past Coleman, Delaney whispered just loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear. This ain't over, boy. You and your Jap bitch are gonna burn. Coleman tensed but didn't respond. Davis, standing nearby, taking notes, heard it clearly. The line had been crossed. What happened next would be inevitable as sunrise. Evening fell over Tokyo with a soft light that made even ruins look almost beautiful. The crisis seemed averted. Rations restored. Protests canceled. Delaney put in his place. Coleman walked Keiko back to her building, through streets that smelled of cooking fires and distant cherry blossoms, both exhausted, but quietly hopeful that perhaps systems could change when good people refused to accept injustice. Your brother, Keiko said as they walked. The pilot? You think he comes home safe? I hope so. David's got 9 more missions before rotation stateside. Every day I worry. But if anyone makes it through, it's him. He's the best flyer in his squadron. My husband used to say hope is not plan, but plan without hope is just going through motions. I think your brother has both. They reached her building. Through the window, the rocking horse was visible, silhouetted against candlelight. That absurd toy that had become so much more. The evening air smelled of smoke and spring rain. Somewhere a radio played American jazz. For a moment, Tokyo felt almost peaceful. Keiko, I want you to know something, Coleman said. Whatever happens with Delaney's investigation, you're protected. That auxiliary designation is legitimate. Captain Hendricks guaranteed it. Even if they come after me, you're safe. I don't want to be safe if it costs you everything. Then we're both in trouble, he smiled, because I ain't stopping. As Coleman turned to leave, the gunshot cracked through evening's peace like the world splitting open. Both dove for cover, instinctively military training overriding thought. More shots deliberate and controlled coming from the building across the street. Muzzle flashes in windows. The sharp smell of cordite mixing with spring air there. The sergeant and the Jap. Delaney's voice thick with alcohol and rage. Tried to warn you, Coleman. Should have stayed in your place. Coleman pulled Keiko toward the building entrance as bullets struck walls, sending splinters flying like wooden shrapnel. Inside, now they crashed through the doorway. Coleman assessed quickly with the tactical mind of a man who'd survived Jim Crow Alabama by learning to read danger in a glance. 3 shooters positioned across street, maybe 40 yards. Not trying to kill shots hitting high on walls, but one stray bullet could change that in a heartbeat. And they were drunk. Drunk men with rifles are unpredictable as spring storms. Stay low, Coleman ordered. Get to the back room. What about you? I'm ending this. He moved to the window, taking cover behind the wall's solid section. Shouted across the street with all the authority of his rank and the moral certainty of a man who'd decided that some lines couldn't be crossed without resistance. Delaney, stand down. That's a direct order. You ain't got authority over me anymore. Coleman, Captain's gonna see you for what you are. Traitor, protecting enemies, more shots. One shattered the rocking horse's front leg with a crack like a bone breaking. Wood splintering, stuffing scattering. The hidden compartment partially exposed cans rolling across the floor. Keiko gasped. The violation was symbolic and profound. That toy represented everything they'd built. Protection, partnership, the possibility that mercy could exist even in occupation's brutal mathematics. Keiko appeared beside Coleman at the window, refusing to hide in the back room. I'm not leaving you alone. Damn it, Keiko. No. Her voice firm with a certainty she'd learned sitting on that horse while 3 soldiers tried to move her. You stood for me. I stand for you. We do this together. Coleman understood. This wasn't about protection anymore. This was about showing Delaney that fear wouldn't work, that some people couldn't be moved by violence any more than by intimidation. He stepped into the doorway, huge risk fully exposed, backlit by candlelight, shouted across with every ounce of moral authority he'd earned through 8 years of watching injustice, and finally deciding to do something about it. Delaney, you're shooting at superior NCO and authorized civilian auxiliary. That's assault on military personnel. You're already facing court-martial. Delaney emerged from cover, drunk and rage-blind, waving his rifle like a prophet brandishing scripture. Court-martial, you're the one who will face charges, sleeping with the enemy, stealing supplies, undermining American authority. I've done none of those things, and you know it, Coleman replied, voice calm but forceful. This is about your pride, your prejudice, and your fear that a black man can do his job better than you can do yours. Truth spoken plainly, cutting through everything. The gathering crowd of soldiers heard it. Stevens and Walsh heard it. Even in their drunken haze, they recognized the moment for what it was. Not just about Coleman and Keiko, about whether America's ideals applied to everyone or just to some. Sound of vehicles approaching fast. Military Police Davis driving the lead jeep, Captain Hendricks in passenger seat. They'd been monitoring radio chatter, heard reports of shots fired, responded with the speed of men who'd been expecting something like this. MPs surrounded Delaney's position. Weapons drawn, voices sharp with command authority. Drop your weapons. Hands visible now, Delaney realized he was trapped. Let his rifle fall with a clatter that seemed to echo through the whole ward. Stevens and Walsh surrendered immediately. They were followers, not true believers. They'd been drunk and angry, but facing court-martial sobered them faster than any amount of coffee. Hendricks strode toward the scene, taking in the bullet holes, the shattered rocking horse Keiko and Coleman standing together in the doorway. His face was stone, but his eyes held something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. Perhaps both. Corporal Delaney, you're under arrest for assault with deadly weapon conduct, unbecoming destruction of civilian property, attempted intimidation of military personnel, and being drunk on duty. He paused, letting the weight settle. Your complaint against Sergeant Coleman? It's now evidence of motive in your court-martial. Congratulations. You just ended your own career trying to end his. The next morning brought formal inquiry. JAG investigation. Colonel Williams, presiding, a man whose silver hair and measured speech suggested decades of untangling military justice's complicated knots. Present all the principals and witnesses. The room smelled of strong coffee and nervous sweat. The case against Coleman collapsed systematically like a house of cards touched by truth's steady wind. Supply requisitions all properly documented, signed by appropriate authorities. Morrison testified that every item went through official channels, showed the paper trail that proved Coleman's careful adherence to protocol even while pushing its boundaries. Civilian Auxiliary Program, fully authorized by Hendricks, approved by higher command. Keiko's designation was legitimate official employment, not fraternization. The distinction mattered legally and symbolically. Meeting with Yamamoto, part of Coleman's duties in civilian affairs. Successfully prevented violent protests. Should be commended, not condemned. The photographs Delaney thought proved conspiracy actually documented exactly what Coleman's job description required. Yamamoto's testimony, delivered through Keiko's translation, carried weight that transcended the formal hearing room. Sergeant Coleman treated us with dignity and respect. He mediated peacefully. Without him, many might have died yesterday, both American soldiers and Japanese civilians. He risked his career to prevent violence. That is not conspiracy. That is courage. Davis testified with the earnest conviction of youth that hadn't yet learned to hide behind diplomatic language. Sir, I've worked with Sergeant Coleman for 4 months. He's the best NCO I've served under. Everything he does is about building cooperation, preventing conflict. Corporal Delaney, on the other hand, has made multiple racist comments, tried to get other soldiers to harass Miss Fujimoto, and clearly harbors prejudice against Sergeant Coleman's race. Physical evidence from the shooting scene. Bullet impacts all high on walls designed to intimidate, not kill, but reckless endangerment nonetheless. Delaney's blood alcohol level .14, drunk on duty. Multiple witnesses heard Delaney's threats in racist language. The case built itself through accumulation of facts that couldn't be denied or spun into something else. Colonel Williams delivered his findings with the measured cadence of a man who understood that words spoken in official capacity carried weight beyond their immediate moment. Sergeant Coleman, your methods are unconventional. You push boundaries of standard protocols. But nothing you've done violates military law. In fact, your work exemplifies best practices for occupation management, turning potential enemies into partners through respect and practical assistance. He looked directly at Coleman. The rocking horse distribution, creative logistics solution, meeting with civilian leaders, proper liaison work, protecting Miss Fujimoto from harassment. Exactly what the auxiliary program was designed to do. His gaze shifted to Delaney still in custody, face drawn from a hangover that was probably as much emotional as alcoholic. Corporal Delaney, your complaint appears motivated by personal animosity with obvious racial undertones. Your subsequent actions, surveillance harassment, armed assault, confirm this assessment. Findings. Sergeant Coleman is cleared of all allegations, recommended for commendation for exemplary civilian affairs work. Corporal Delaney will face general court-martial. Stevens and Walsh will face lesser charges as accomplices. Dismissed. If this story has moved you, if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, please hit that like button and subscribe. These untold stories of courage from both American service members and the civilians they protected deserve to be remembered. And if you've got family stories from this era, share them in the comments. Your history matters. Now let's talk about what happened next. 2 days later, Coleman arrived at Keiko's building carrying tools and fresh cut wood. Davis accompanied him, the young private having volunteered without being asked. Heard you had some property damage. Thought we'd fix it. They worked in quiet companionship. Davis revealed his father had been a carpenter back in Ohio, taught him woodworking as a boy. The sound of plane against wood smooth and rhythmic, shavings curling like question marks. The smell of fresh cut pine mixing with old leather in the ever-present Tokyo smoke. Davis carved a replacement leg, matching the original shape with careful attention to detail. Coleman sanded it smooth, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate work. Keiko provided tea made from her improved rations. Real tea leaves, not the bark substitutes she'd been using. My dad used to say Davis offered while fitting the new leg that anything broken can be fixed. Might not be the same as before, but sometimes the repair makes it stronger. Coleman fitted the new leg, secured it with glue and dowels. Let it dry in the spring sunshine that streamed through the window, then tested it carefully, sitting on the horse rocking gently. The repair held, solid as ever, maybe stronger. It was a symbolic moment, though none of them said so. What was broken had been mended. The repairs, visible but functional. A history of damage that didn't erase the object's purpose. Perhaps even enhanced it, the scars becoming part of the story worth telling. Over the following weeks, changes rippled outward like circles from a stone dropped in still water. Ration Policy SCAP approved Hendrix's review request after he'd attached Yamamoto's medical documentation and Morrison's supply analysis. Previous allocation levels restored. Pilot programs for civilian gardens approved. Within 3 months, mortality rates began declining, malnutrition cases dropping 68%. Auxiliary program expanded to include 12 more Japanese civilians as translators and liaisons. Became model for other occupation zones. Proof that cooperation worked better than coercion, that yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's partners if treated with dignity. Coleman's reputation spread. Other units requested his guidance on civilian affairs protocols. Captain Hendrix promoted him to Master Sergeant, recommended him for officer candidate school. The recommendation noted Sergeant Coleman demonstrates exceptional ability to build bridges between American forces and occupied populations, exhibits moral courage in challenging unjust policies, and serves as model for the kind of leadership that will be needed to maintain peace in the post-war world. Yamamoto's community gardens planted in cleared areas. Small supervised markets established where civilians could trade goods and skills. The slow work of rebuilding, not just infrastructure, but social fabric. Starvation deaths dropped. Children began showing normal development again. Hope, that fragile thing, began taking root in rubble. Delaney's fate, general court-martial convicted him on all charges. Dishonorable discharge. Sentence 18 months military prison, then deportation back to the States with dishonorable record following him forever. His career ended not by Coleman's actions, but by his own hatred eating itself from inside out. 5 years after that night in Tokyo, the war officially ended. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, 48 nations signing an agreement that transformed occupation into partnership, enemies into allies. September 8, 1951. Among the Japanese delegation, Keiko Fujimoto, now 33, wearing professional attire, serving as official translator for the peace negotiations. She'd spent 5 years building bridges through language, translating not just words but intentions, cultural contexts, the space between what's said and what's meant. Across the Grand Hall, she spotted a familiar face. Major Marcus Coleman, promoted twice since Tokyo, now wearing insignia that reflected his rise through ranks that had once seemed closed to men who looked like him. Beside Coleman stood another officer, tall and confident, with eyes that held the particular alertness of men who'd flown through flak and fighters to get home alive. David Coleman, Major Army Air Forces. The Tuskegee Airmen had made it home after all. Miss Fujimoto. David extended his hand. Finally meeting the woman my brother wrote so much about. He said you taught him that resistance doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like sitting still. Keiko smiled. And your brother taught me that systems can change when good people refuse to accept injustice. The rocking horse Marcus asked. Still in Tokyo, in museum now. Tokyo Peace Memorial. Donated it last year. They created exhibit about occupation, the difficult parts and the hopeful parts. Your horse has its own display case. Not my horse, Marcus corrected. Ours. Symbol of something we built together. The plaque says Keiko continued symbol of mercy during occupation. Gift from Sergeant Marcus Coleman to civilian Keiko Fujimoto, 1946. Reminder that even in darkest times, humanity can bridge divides. Cut to present day. The Smithsonian Museum, National Museum of American History. Camera moves through exhibition titled Occupation of Japan. Stories of Reconciliation. The lighting is soft, reverent, the kind reserved for objects that have transcended their original purpose to become vessels of meaning. The rocking horse sits in a climate-controlled case, beautifully preserved despite its age and trauma. The repaired front leg is visible, darker wood, careful joinery, evidence of being fixed with love and attention to detail. The leather saddle is cracked now, but still supple. The horsehair mane slightly faded but intact. The glass eyes still catch light in ways that seem almost alive. The plaque reads, The Rocking Horse Protocol, Tokyo, March 1946. This children's toy represents an extraordinary act of mercy during the American occupation of Japan. Sergeant Marcus Coleman, later major, distributed similar items to vulnerable Japanese civilians, providing hidden supplies and official cover while mediating between occupation forces and occupied population. Coleman's civilian auxiliary program became model for humane occupation practices. His courage in confronting discrimination within military ranks and his partnership with Japanese civilians, like translator Keiko Fujimoto, demonstrated that former enemies could become partners in peace. The horse's simple instruction, just sit on it, became metaphor for dignified resistance, refusing to be moved from what's rightfully yours, even when power imbalances suggest you should. Coleman and Fujimoto remain lifelong friends. Both received commendations for their work building bridges between American and Japanese peoples. This artifact reminds us that peace is built not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of courage, compassion, and commitment to human dignity. Camera pulls back to show a modern Japanese-American family reading the plaque. Young girl, maybe 8, points excitedly at the horse. Mother explains in Japanese, then English, this horse helped people when they were scared. It taught them that being still and strong is sometimes braver than fighting. The girl studies the repaired leg. Why is this part different? Because it broke. But someone fixed it, and the fix made it stronger. The girl reaches toward the glass, not touching, but connecting, seeing history not as dead past, but as living legacy, as proof that ordinary people making difficult choices can change the world in ways that echo through generations. Final shot, close-up of the rocking horse's glass eyes, still almost alive after all these years. They called it the Rocking Horse Protocol, a simple instruction that saved lives. Just sit on it. Don't move. Make them work for every inch. But it became something more. A philosophy, a recognition that power doesn't always require force, that resistance doesn't always require violence, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to cooperate with your own diminishment. Sergeant Marcus Coleman understood that systems don't change themselves. They change when people inside them choose fairness over safety. Keiko Fujimoto understood that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining dignity even when circumstances conspire to strip it away. Together, they proved that even in occupation, even in systems designed to dehumanize humanity, can persist. Not through grand heroism, but through small, stubborn acts of mercy. One toy, one instruction, one choice to stand when it would be easier to walk away. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. Marcus Coleman rose to colonel serving 30 years. He pioneered cultural sensitivity training in U.S. military. Keiko Fujimoto became chief translator at multiple international peace conferences. She taught reconciliation workshops until her death in 1998. David Coleman flew 96 combat missions with Tuskegee. Airmen received Distinguished Flying Cross, retired as Brigadier General. The Civilian Auxiliary Program Coleman created became template for future occupation and peacekeeping operations. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest legacies.